thanks for that call. That will be our last for Open Phones for tonight, but we'll be back beginning at 6 a.m. Eastern Time with the full morning 4 hours of telephone calls and further discussion of this and showing you many of the news stories. And that will take us until the Congress comes in at 10. Let's now take you to the BBC in London for their breakfast newscast, and we'll show you this live from London for the next 3 hours.
Good morning and welcome to Breakfast with Jeremy Bone and Sophie Rayworth. The headlines this morning: Americans are trying to take in the scale of the terrorist attacks and understand how they could have happened.
The first accounts have emerged of how the planes were hijacked before crashing into the World Trade Center.
A third skyscraper collapsed in the wake of the blasts. Hundreds of rescue workers are missing.
How will the U.S. respond? President Bush has vowed to hunt down those who carried out the attack.
Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America.
President Bush addressed the American nation a few hours ago and confirmed what everyone feared. Thousands of people have died in the series of terrorist attacks on New York and Washington yesterday. The rescue operation continues, but it's an incredibly dangerous operation with 300 firefighters among those missing.
Overnight, it emerged that passengers on board the hijacked airliners made phone calls before they crashed into the World Trade Center. They talked of hijackers stabbing members of the crew as they seized the planes. In his address to the nation, the president made it clear there would be action against those judged to be responsible and those who harbored the terrorists. Our first report this morning is from the BBC's Jane Stanley in New York City.
The famous New York skyline, but no longer so familiar. The Twin Towers are gone, replaced by a plume of smoke and ash. This is a city in shock. Its usually packed hub of Times Square, all but deserted, emptied by the news. It is also a city in mourning. New Yorkers are turning to their churches to try to find comfort. Others are in panic. They're stripping supermarket shelves and cash machines. They feel insecure and no longer safe. As emergency teams worked through the night, their citizens came to help with blood for the injured. New York hospitals are packed and preparing for more admissions. But the horrible reality people are struggling to accept, that there will be very many victims who will not make it here. The sheer impact of the attack was just too great. The planes had ignited ferocious fires in the World Trade Center towers. People tried to jump to safety.
Oh, no.
But then the towers collapsed. The debris buried all in its wake. It may be that hundreds of emergency workers were crushed beneath.
Debris was just falling from the sky.
Paul Lemos took these photographs as he was giving water to the firefighters and police officers at the center. Events unfolded before him.
You can see people standing on the ledges and just one at a time, just falling, trumping, and they would watch them and they would come flying down and their hands would be moving and stuff, and it was almost like they were trying to get help. And then you would just hear the boom, and they were landing all over the place.
New York has not slept. This, the worst night of its life. It is struggling to cope. Lower Manhattan and what remains of the World Trade Center behind me is now effectively sealed off. The emergency work continues, but New York is not the same city it once was. It's now full of panic and of grief. Jane Stanley, BBC News, New York.
Well, it's difficult to establish communications with New York at the moment. Our correspondent Rob Watson joins us now from Washington. Rob, there's some latest news about the number feared dead at the Pentagon.
Well, there are still no confirmed reports of casualties either from here in Washington, D.C., or indeed just up the road in New York City. What we do have is some reports that have been on American television, which have been citing firefighters in Washington, saying that maybe up to 800 people were killed at the Pentagon. But again, worth stressing very strongly that those are only reported figures on American television. Now, in New York, no figure at all, no official figure at all on casualties at the World Trade Center. But again, there was word from the fire department there saying that perhaps up to 300 of their firemen were missing. But the big picture is that it's been a tough day for the United States, a tough day for President George Bush. The end of the day that shook America and the world. After crisscrossing the country for security reasons, President Bush finally returned to Washington with a promise to hunt down those behind the attacks and with reassurance for a troubled nation.
These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation.
Even as the president was speaking, emergency crews continued searching through the carnage at the Pentagon just a short distance away. It was the first ever attack on the symbol of America's military might, the anger there palpable.
I would tell you up front, I have no intentions of discussing today what comes next, but make no mistake about it, your armed forces are ready.
Let's get away from the building, ladies and gentlemen.
The attacks had brought the government to a dramatic halt. Congressmen fleeing Capitol Hill for fear of further assaults, but they came back.
One thing that happens here in this place is when American suffers and when people perpetrate acts against this country, we as a Congress and as a government stand united, and we stand together.
As the congressman turned to leave, there was even what appeared to be a spontaneous outbreak of patriotism. Too little too late for some, perhaps. Security in the Capitol has now been increased. There are sharpshooters at the White House, more police on the streets, and new safety measures promised nationwide.
Travelers will indeed see increased security measures at our airports, train stations, and other key sites. There will be higher levels of surveillance, more stringent searches. Airport curbside luggage check-in will no longer be allowed.
As often happens here in this most religious of countries, Americans have started turning to their places of worship for comfort and answers to the horrors they and the rest of the world have witnessed. America feels somehow different now. Fortress USA has been breached, leaving a nation feeling shocked, shaken, and decidedly vulnerable.
Well, Rob, President Bush there back in Washington last night, or tonight for you, he made very clear, didn't he, that there was going to be retribution and that there would be no mercy for those who harbored whoever did this.
That's exactly what he said, because I think President Bush was trying to do two things, really, in his televised address to the nation. On the one hand, to try and get a sense of calm, to reassure people. For example, he said that the government would continue running, it was continuing running, no need to worry about that. But secondly, to try and indicate to Americans that this would not go unpunished, and that, yes, they wouldn't just go after the terrorists, but anyone that was harboring them, perhaps an allusion to Osama bin Laden and the Taliban rulers of Afghanistan, where he is currently operating out of.
What is the atmosphere like in Washington tonight, or for you tonight?
Can you say that one again?
What is the atmosphere like in Washington now?
The atmosphere is still numb, as it was after the attacks first took place, quite a number of hours now, because Americans are still very much coming to terms with just the massive scale of these attacks here in Washington, and of course the larger attacks in New York City. The United States, the American people, are not used to such incredible acts of domestic terrorism. Indeed, what country is? So America is coming to terms with it. In terms of official America, that is the US government, they're still scrambling to keep the country running and, of course, to try and track down who was responsible for these attacks.
As the hours go on, more and more information, more detail coming out about the hijacks themselves, and there were phone calls made from the planes, weren't there?
Absolutely, that really is one of the most terrifying details that has come out. There were at least 3, maybe more calls that were made by passengers on these airplanes, also from an air stewardess. Indeed, one of the calls came from the wife of the Solicitor General, a senior government figure here in Washington. She said that the plane had been taken over by terrorists. What should she do? She screamed, and that was the last that he heard from her. But the U.S. officials, the U.S. authorities, are trying to use these very disturbing mobile phone calls that came from these planes in their efforts to track down who were responsible for these attacks.
And we're hearing from New York that it is believed there are still people alive under the rubble.
Yes, just in the last few minutes, a couple of workers were pulled from the wreckage of the World Trade Center. It seems extraordinary when you consider those two vast buildings crashing to the ground. But two people pulled out, not sure what condition they're in, just how critically injured they are, but they are still alive.
Rob Watson, thank you very much.
Well, here the repercussions are also enormous. There continues to be major disruptions for air passengers. All transatlantic flights from the UK are still grounded. There is heightened security at all British airports. No planes are being allowed to fly over central London. People are being advised to check with their airline before travelling. The Foreign Office has set up a special telephone number for anyone concerned about friends and relatives. It's 0207 008 0000. That's 0207 008 0000.
Well, the American authorities still have no clear idea who carried out the attacks. The main suspect, though, is Osama bin Laden, the Saudi terrorist leader who's thought to live in exile in Afghanistan. But all Islamic and extremist groups responsible for previous attacks on the US are under scrutiny.
The thick, choking dust that was New York's World Trade Center has barely settled. But already, American investigators have embarked on the agonizing business of trying to find out who did all this. A series of mobile phone calls made by terrified passengers will help the FBI to piece together a picture of what went on inside each of the 4 hijacked planes. And somewhere in the lists of passengers that boarded the aircraft will almost certainly lie further clues. Some reports suggest the authorities may already be looking at names linked to this man, Osama bin Laden, renegade Saudi businessman and the head of a terrorist network with a track record of attacks against American targets. This was his group's most audacious operation so far, coordinated bombings of US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. More than 220 people died. The perpetrators were later extradited to the US and put on trial. Life sentences were handed down earlier this year in New York. America retaliated dramatically, but with little discernible effect. Cruise missiles were launched against his suspected base in eastern Afghanistan. Some of his supporters were killed. Bin Laden himself escaped. His links with Sudan also led to a mistaken attack on a pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum. The owner is still looking for compensation. This was a blunder which may cause the Bush administration to pause before striking back this time. And this is not the first time bin Laden's name has been associated with an attack on the World Trade Center. 8 years ago, a bomb planted in an underground car park killed 6 people. Ramzi Youssef, a man with suspected links to bin Laden's network, was convicted after a highly publicized trial. Almost a year ago, a suicide bomber attacked an American warship, the USS Cole, at anchor in the port of Aden. Again, Osama bin Laden was the chief suspect. This morning comes word of a statement published in Pakistan in which the militant leader denies involvement in, but expresses support for the latest outrage. But with American officials already pointing the finger, such denials may have little effect. Paul Adams, BBC News.
So how was this disaster able to happen? That's something we'll be examining throughout the programme this morning. Joining me now in the studio is Nigel Churton, who's Chief Executive of the Control Risks Group, which advises businesses around the world on preventing terrorism. Also with us in the studio is Philip Baum, who's an expert in aviation security. Nigel, if I could talk to you first of all. You advise companies on preventing risks to their operations, but no one surely could think of an outrage as big as this.
No, it's the worst terrorist attack we've ever seen. It's clearly hugely well planned. Been in planning for a long time, and once it took off, there was no stopping it.
So how can people try to get on their feet again, I suppose, in the sort of businesses that you deal with?
Well, I think it's a major step change in the whole terrorist game. I mean, we're talking about a large number of terrorists who are prepared to commit suicide and take a lot of people with them. From everyone else this morning, businesses have got to get up and running again. particularly those that have got people based in countries like Pakistan and the Yemen, and even people who are in Afghanistan itself, it's going to be very difficult, and people are obviously very, very nervous of what happens next.
And worldwide, presumably, businesses and countries and organisations, even organisations like the BBC, will be taking some steps to make sure that their own staff are safe.
Yes, you're going to see a major upsurge at the moment in access control on all major corporate buildings, the government prestige buildings. The Prime Minister's already said that there's increased protection, and airports are going to be a nightmare to travel through for some time to come.
But do you think it will subside back to the way it usually is, or will, because of the whole enormous size of all this, will we see a sea change in the way that these risks are perceived?
Well, I think there is a natural sea change, because there's always a reaction to everything. I mean, security is always trying to work on the best available information. The position at the moment is this is something so new and so large, it will have to be reconsidered, and we'll go from here.
We are talking about not just one plane being hijacked, or 2 or 3, it's 4 planes being hijacked. I mean, how is it possible to do that? How is it possible to breach that security?
Well, this is certainly something totally new for the aviation security industry. And it just goes to show that we're dealing not only with maybe the traditional forms of aviation security, such as passenger screening. The chances are, in an incident like this, that we're dealing with insiders, people working on the inside either of the airlines or working at the airport. And this has been a very well thought out, coordinated plan that doesn't simply rely on traditional screening measures to prevent them taking place.
Because we're hearing this morning there is phone calls that were made from planes saying that the stewardesses, some of them had been stabbed. I mean, these people had got knives onto the plane somehow.
Well, yes, which is actually a fairly unsophisticated weapon to actually use in terms of a hijack. But realistically, aircraft have been hijacked in the past by a knife from a meal tray. So you don't necessarily need weapons of grenades or guns to actually hijack an aircraft.
But what about the actual flying the plane itself? I mean, are we talking about them having, whoever's done this, having trained pilots? Because presumably no commercial pilot would ever slam his plane straight into a building like the World Trade Center.
I do not believe that any trained pilot would, even with a gun to his temple, fly an aircraft, a passenger jet, into the World Trade Center or anywhere else. They would have intentionally missed and died in any case. This would imply, these type of incidents would indicate that the people weren't necessarily pilots, but were certainly given some training in the operation of a civilian airliner.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Gentlemen, thanks.
Well, if you were watching any of the coverage yesterday, you may well have heard our New York business correspondent, Stephen Evans, who actually was in the World Trade Center when the planes hit the towers. Stephen was telling a local New York television station what he had seen when, during the interview, one of the towers collapsed behind him.
Most of the people around simply can't understand what happened. People were just standing around, talking to each other, nodding their heads. Oh my God. We gotta go. We gotta go. We gotta go. Oh my God. Guys, we gotta go. Fucking go. Right, sorry, it's going down. It's going down. Don't worry, it's going down. It's going down. Okay from here. But you need to shoot. Sorry, it's not my job. Come on, get in the building, quick! Over here! Get in! Get in! Don't go into a building. Right, no game. Right, come on, come in. Get this. Get this. We're good. We're good here. We're good here. We're good here. We're good here. We're good here.
Well, graphic evidence there of the catastrophe that befell New York and America yesterday morning. Well, Moira's here to bring us regular updates on the situation. Moira.
Good morning to you. President Bush has said thousands of people died in yesterday's terrorist attacks. He made it clear America would respond and said there would be no distinction between the terrorists and their hosts in the hunt for those responsible. The rescue operation continues in New York and Washington. People are still alive in the rubble, but 200 firefighters and 78 New York police officers are among the missing. The first accounts have begun to emerge of what happened on board the hijacked aircraft, which crashed into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Passengers made phone calls saying the planes were being hijacked by men armed with knives. Here, extra security measures are in place at public buildings and military installations. The Prime Minister is to meet defence and security chiefs in Downing Street this morning. Those are the latest headlines. Back to Jeremy and Sophie.
Papers this morning are full of graphic accounts and graphic pictures as well of what happened in the States only yesterday. The Telegraph tells it as it is, really, with an extraordinary picture there. The Telegraph, War on America, and look at that. No movie special effect has been able to come up with that. It was more than a movie, it was reality, which is what makes it so horrendous.
Absolutely extraordinary pictures on the papers this morning. The Guardian there, quite simply, the shot there of the towers going up and a declaration of war, their headline at the bottom.
The Independent, Doomsday America, similar photograph there. The second plane, I think, plunging into the tower there, the World Trade Center. Not long after that, of course, they both collapsed.
The Times this morning, when war came to America, a description also from one of the Times reporters, James Bone, who was looking up at the World Trade Center minutes before the Twin Towers fell from the sky.
The Times also has this picture section. You know, a lot of comparisons have been made with Pearl Harbor in 1941, a day that will live in infamy. The president then said, 10:02 a.m., September the 11th, 2001, across two sheets. Look at that photo. The whole of Lower Manhattan shrouded in smoke. That's after the collapse of the buildings.
The Daily Express as well, similar pictures on most of the papers this morning. Declaration of war. The Daily Star, they're asking, is this the end of the world, they say?
No, it is not the end of the world, but as the Sun says, this is a day that changed the world, and there it is, the photograph on the, again across, another picture on the back of the plane hitting. Some of the there are also graphic photos, and here's one of this is, to me, I think, you know, this story is more than anything about the sheer horror, the human horror, being in that building, being on those planes. There's someone who threw him or herself out of the window, plunging to certain death from the top of one of the towers.
Eyewitnesses saying they just saw people plunging from 80 floors up. The Daily Mail there, Apocalypse, New York, September the 11th, 2001. And as with the rest of the papers, pages and pages of coverage of them.
Well, as you can imagine, there's been reaction from around the world. Leaders, including most in the Middle East, have offered condolences and support to America after the attacks. Many ordinary people have also offered sympathy, but there were some scattered celebrations in some of the Palestinian areas and in Iraq.
This is the worst terrorist atrocity the world has witnessed, and its devastating consequences on the most powerful nation have reverberated around the globe. As the superpower closed its doors, the rest of the world assessed their security and vulnerability. At home, the Prime Minister urged the world to unite to eradicate mass terrorism, and he was resolute in his solidarity with the United States.
We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy. And we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
There's been worldwide condemnation of the unprecedented attacks, and state condolences have flooded in.
There can be no doubt that these attacks are deliberate acts of terrorism, carefully planned and coordinated. And as such, I condemn them utterly.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin said his country had experienced terrorism, and his people understood the feelings of the American people. We are with you, he said, and we share and feel your pain in full. For some, though, in the Middle East, the American suffering has been a time for jubilation. In Lebanon's largest refugee camp, the home of 75,000 Palestinians, shots were fired in celebration. And in the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, more triumphant scenes. But Middle East leaders have shared in the worldwide outrage.
We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
I believe that together we can defeat these forces of evil. At this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people.
Terrorism of this magnitude will take months, if not years, for the world to come to terms with. But already changes in global security are afoot. This morning, Tony Blair will review Britain's tightened measures at another emergency meeting. Caroline Tomstead, BBC News.
Well, the effect of the attacks on the global economy was immediate. The FTSE 100 index went down by 5.7% yesterday. And this morning, Japan's Nikkei index fell heavily at the start of trading. Well, Declan Curry joins us now from the London Stock Exchange. Declan, the long-term impacts of all this, is it possible to see what they could be?
Sophie, it's too early for there to be any sensible comment at this stage about the impact of this on the global economy. It will take many, many days before people are able to take stock of what happened yesterday, and before many of those big companies on Wall Street that were affected by this atrocity yesterday are able to take stock and look at what might be happening with the economy and with stock markets. But it is fair to say this. Recession in the United States seems to have been held back in recent months simply by the exuberance of consumers in America, of shoppers going in and spending their dollars in shopping malls and stores up and down Main Street. The economists that we've been talking to say it is inconceivable that American shoppers will retain this exuberance after this, that there will be some sort of dent in consumer confidence, and that could have an impact on the broader economy. Then you've got the whole issue of the actual costs of what happened yesterday, the cost to the economy in terms of economic activity coming to a halt in America for the next couple of days. Also the cost to people like insurance companies and banks who will have to pay an awful lot in terms of money for what happened yesterday, though of course the cost of that pale into insignificance when compared with the human cost.
Declan, we'll be hearing plenty more from you later on this morning. Thank you.
The reverberations of this story will clearly be going on not for weeks or months, but for years. This morning, we're devoting the programme to it, and I suspect we'll be devoting the programme to its consequences for some time to come. We're looking at the weather, though, as usual, and Sarah is going to tell us how it's going. Sarah.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hello there. Well, many places are dry at the moment. Already, though, it's raining across...
You're watching live BBC coverage of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon from earlier on Tuesday. We'll be simulcasting this BBC morning show for about the next 2.5 hours here on C-SPAN, and we'll be returning in just a moment or two. We'll also be taking your phone calls on the attacks beginning at 6 a.m. Eastern Time here on this network. And then later on Wednesday, live coverage of the U.S. House as members meet to debate a resolution condemning the attacks. That'll be on Wednesday at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 7 Pacific, live here on C-SPAN. The Senate will also be meeting on Wednesday. They're expected to debate a similar resolution. Live Senate coverage on our companion network, C-SPAN 2, also at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And while we wait for the BBC to return, here's a look at some of the images from the Pentagon from earlier this evening. These were taken about 7:15 Eastern Time. Some of the pictures from the Pentagon from early on Tuesday evening. Now we'll go back to our simulcast of the BBC's live morning newscast and their coverage of the terrorist attacks in the U.S. and some local reaction.
747 was halfway across the Atlantic when news of events in America were announced by the crew.
Most people were just stunned, really. Stunned, and obviously we didn't have a lot of information.
Well, we got relatives in Canada who are quite worried because we were LA bound. I guess the planes that were hijacked were LA bound as well. So, but no, they know we're all right now.
Gwenda Jones's 24-year-old son Ed is studying music in Manhattan, and though she's been assured he's safe, she's been unable to contact him from her Cardiff home.
My daughter rang me yesterday to tell me about it. She had fortunately spoken to her brother, and he's quite safe, and his American girlfriend is safe, but we're obviously very concerned about them. We can't contact them because all the phone lines are down now.
Wales's leading churchman, the Archbishop of Wales, was just a few blocks away from the Trade Centre when the first plane struck. The Most Reverend Rowan Williams last night phoned colleagues back in Wales to assure them he was safe.
And that's all from UK Today. Now back to Jeremy and Sophie.
This is Breakfast. It's just gone 6:30, bringing you coverage of the aftermath of the terrorist attacks which destroyed the World Trade Center and also severely damaged the Pentagon in Washington.
Right now, let's get a summary of all this morning's main news with Maura.
Good morning. President Bush has said he fears thousands of people have died in yesterday's terrorist attacks in New York and Washington. The emergency services are working to rescue anyone they can from the rubble of the collapsed Twin Towers. The chief of police says some survivors have already been found. Passengers on board the hijacked planes made phone calls saying that men armed with knives had taken over the aircraft before they were crashed into the buildings. Hundreds of rescue workers are among those feared dead, killed when the towers collapsed unexpectedly. Extra security measures are in place across the United States in the wake of the apparently coordinated hijack of a plane which was crashed into the Pentagon in Washington. Up to 800 people are feared dead there. President Bush returned to Washington late yesterday evening. He went on television to assure the American public the perpetrators of the attacks would be caught.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
In other news, a London hospital is expected to face criticism today over the high number of patients who died following heart and lung transplants. The transplant program at St George's Hospital in Tooting was suspended last year after 10 of the 14 patients died in just 10 months. Australia has ordered a troop ship carrying hundreds of asylum seekers to sail directly to the Pacific island state of Nauru while the government appeals against a court ruling that they must be allowed entry to Australia. The troop carrier was due to take the refugees to Papua New Guinea, from where they would be flown to New Zealand and to Nauru for their asylum claims to be processed. In sport, Arsenal made a disappointing start to the Champions League last night, losing 1-0 away to Real Mallorca. Liverpool managed a 1-1 draw with Boavista at Anfield.
While Liverpool was still settling in, Portuguese champions Boavista took the initiative. Silva's shot giving them the lead after just 3 minutes. Liverpool were now under pressure, and it was up to the man in form, Michael Owen, to equalise, his 12th goal of the season. The Group D match ended 1-1, giving Gerard Houllier plenty to think about for the campaign ahead. In Group C, the issue for Arsenal was discipline. Ashley Cole's challenge on Alberto Luque made him the team's 3rd player to be sent off in just 5 matches this season. Vicente Ngonga scored from the spot for Real Mallorca. The only goal of the game after 12 minutes made Arsenal's opening Champions League match a losing one. In round 2 of the Worthington Cup, Division 2's Reading beat West Ham 6-5 on penalties. Adrian Vivash scoring from the spot to knock West Ham out of the competition. Premiership new boys Fulham were tested by Division 3's Rochdale before Lewis Boamorte scored the winning penalty, taking them through 6-5. While Guy Ipua's late winner against Millwall gave Gillingham a 2-1 win. Katie Booth, BBC News.
So far, back to Sophie.
All right, thank you. As the investigation into the attacks gets underway, the main question must be how the perpetrators were able to commandeer 4 aircraft to such devastating effect. Our reporter Julie Etchingham looks at what little is known about the hijacked flights.
Their images already seared into the world's conscience. Among the many horrors the US is facing are thoughts of what happened on board the 4 aircraft used in the attacks. They'd all taken off at around 8 o'clock in the morning, all hijacked shortly afterwards. All 266 passengers and crew died. The aircraft which hit the World Trade Center were both bound from Boston to Los Angeles. At 8:45 local time, the tragedy began to unfold. American Airlines flight number 11 hit the North Tower of the Trade Center. 18 minutes later, United Airlines flight 175 hit the South Tower. At 9:45, it was the turn of the Pentagon. American Airlines flight 77 had left Dulles Airport near Washington, also bound for Los Angeles. And at 10:48, another crash near Pittsburgh, United Flight 93, due to travel from Newark to San Francisco. Just before this, both World Trade Center towers had collapsed, the scale of the human tragedy extending far beyond the loss of those on board the aircraft. Air traffic control knew something was wrong as soon as the planes had gone off course. The director of security at Boston Airport, however, said they'd had no indication of a hijacking. Several frantic mobile phone calls made by passengers have emerged. Barbara Olson, wife of the US Solicitor General, rang her husband twice. "What should I tell the pilots to do?" she asked. She said her aircraft, which crashed at the Pentagon, had been hijacked by attackers using knives. Another passenger who died in the Pittsburgh crash had called the emergency services and said, "We're being hijacked. We're being hijacked." So far, there have been no reports of hijackers on any of the flights using firearms, which would have been far more difficult to smuggle aboard than knives. It's thought, too, that even if the terrorists had little flying experience, they would have found it relatively easy to steer an aircraft towards such large targets. In the wake of the attacks, it's clear security at American airports will never be the same again. It's clear, too, that trying to piece evidence together could be a task as enormous as the tragedy itself. Julie Etchingham, BBC News.
Well, the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, is meeting Defence and Security Chiefs at Downing Street. He'll be hearing the news from New York, where it is 1:30 a.m. 2 people have been pulled out of the rubble there, and rescue operations clearly are going on. Our political correspondent, Carol Walker, is in Downing Street. Carol, obviously a very sombre mood there and an atmosphere of deep crisis.
That's right, and the Prime Minister in an hour and a half from now chairing another meeting of the Emergency Committee, COBRA, bringing together all the relevant senior cabinet ministers, the Foreign Secretary, the Defence Secretary, Transport Secretary, of course, looking again at these measures that were brought in last night in the immediate aftermath of these terrible events. We're standing here in Downing Street. There's no sound of the planes flying overhead, which we usually hear. And I think also he'll be looking for some advice from security and defence officials as to what is the best way to deal with this threat while trying to retain business as usual. Beyond that, I think he's very determined to try to reinforce the political message that not just Britain but other European leaders too should stand foursquare against what he's called this new evil and should offer full support to the United States.
This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy, and we, like them, will not rest until this evil is driven from our world.
Now, the question, though, Carol, of course, is what happens next once the immediate aftermath is dealt with in the States? There's going to be not just a political move, but a military move coming from somewhere, isn't there? From the States, certainly, possibly from allies, including us.
Well, I think that when the Prime Minister spoke out so swiftly yesterday, he made it very clear that Britain wouldn't shirk its responsibilities, if you like, to one of its old allies, the United States. And I think beyond that, what the Prime Minister is determined to do is to try to ensure that it's not just Britain who does this, not just Britain who's prepared to stand up and stand foursquare with the United States. He spoke last night to Herr Schröder of Germany, to Lionel Jospin, to President Chirac, and to President Putin. And I think that you heard him there talking about democratic nations standing up to terrorism. I think that's the sort of mood that he wants to try to build this sense that it's not just the United States alone that's facing this threat, not just Britain that will try to back it up in whatever way possible, even if that means giving practical support on the ground, but that he wants other European nations to do so as well.
Carol, slight difference of emphasis coming from Paris, where there have been some concerns that there might be a hot-headed American response to that. Nothing of that sort coming from London, presumably.
Well, I think certainly we don't think that the Prime Minister has yet spoken to President Bush. Certainly that was the latest information half an hour ago. He may well be speaking to him within the next hour or two, but obviously there have been a lot of contacts at official level. And I think certainly he will be trying to use his influence to try to urge at least a cool head, at least some form of restraint. I think there is some concern that if there is too rapid a response, perhaps an unconsidered response, when at this stage, of course, no one knows precisely who was behind these terrible events, then that could simply make matters worse. So I think he'll be trying to use what influence he can to urge a cool response, a calm response against what he's described as this new evil in the world.
OK, Carol Walker there at number 10. Thanks for joining us.
Well, it is 20 to 2 in the morning in New York right now. Our correspondent Patrick O'Connell is there. Patrick, we're hearing this morning that there are people believed to be still alive in the rubble of the World Trade Towers.
Yes, we are. We've heard ray of hope from the rubble that people are being pulled out. But equally, we're aware of the fact that just as the events of yesterday were terrifying and shocking, so too will the events of today and the coming days as rescuers get closer and closer to the scene of the tragedy, bearing in mind their work has been hampered by secondary explosions, by fires, by collapsing buildings. And we are being told to prepare ourselves for a tremendous loss of life. And alongside these stories of hope, it's very much felt, I think, in New York that there is going to be a tremendous loss of life revealed the closer the rescuers get. I was there just over an hour ago. The police are working in shifts, but many of their own number, we've been told by the mayor, have lost their lives. Many of the fire service have lost their lives, including some of the people at the very top, as well as some of the people working.
And describe what the scene down there is like, as far as you could see.
Well, as you mentioned, it's nighttime here. The first thing is the streets are deserted. To get down there, I rode my bike. There's no way you think of this city as bristling with yellow cabs. There aren't any. There's no traffic on the streets. When I got down there, the scene that had been the World Trade Center is now illuminated by vast phalanxes of arc lights and police officers and fire crews and paramedics walking up almost as the shifts change, uptown, and you see on their faces the bewilderment, apart from the fact they're trying to do their job. The whole scene is illuminated by electric light, and there is still smoke, and there is still, I think, a fear of what will be produced as the rubble is removed.
How are the hospitals coping with this? They've been put on full alert. We've seen pictures of people queuing around the block to give blood, but when you think of the numbers who've been injured.
Yes, absolutely. Well, in fact, what's perhaps the most worrying thing is that it seems that the hospitals are braced for a new wave of casualties for the reasons I've just described. In other words, there were 300 in one hospital I passed earlier in the day. The paramedics were on the street shouting for people to come and give blood. And 300 people were admitted there, another 200 to another hospital. The numbers have risen from then, but we're all being told to brace ourselves for what happens next as people. And as I say, this would be, of course, a ray of great hope to people in New York to think that people are there. We've heard that some have been making phone calls from beneath the collapsed buildings, and therefore they will be headed directly to hospital the moment they can be released. And that means the hospitals are on standby for a new wave. which of course is a desperate thing, but going back to what you said at the beginning, also implies that there remains hope for some individuals.
One of the most awful things must be for relatives of those who could have been in this house at the time. I mean, I spent 7 hours trying to get through to my sister who lives in New York yesterday. The phones are jammed, aren't they?
They are. The World Trade Center is accurately named. There's a large British expatriate community working in finance here. London, just as it is an important financial centre, it's a two-way street. The whole place is an international village. You think of it as a tall building. You should think of it in terms of its own financial city. That's the scope of it. There are people who have been unable to reach their loved ones, their colleagues. There are people who've reached them. And there are other people who were in the building and saw people jump from it. It's a staggering situation for people in New York. While it will be necessary to discuss and analyse international responses and to search for who did it, right now this is a city dealing with what has happened and braced for the extraordinary news that will come, as if yesterday's was not enough. Who was there? What are their stories? Did they get out? And all around the city are families waiting for news.
Paddy O'Connell, will speak to you later on, but thank you for now.
Well, throughout the programme, Maura will be bringing us regular updates on what is, of course, a huge, huge human tragedy. Maura.
Thank you, Jeremy. President Bush has said that thousands of people died in yesterday's terrorist attacks. He made it clear America would respond, and he said there would be no distinction between the terrorists and their hosts in the hunt for those responsible. The rescue operation continues in New York and Washington. People are still alive in the rubble. Some 300 New York firefighters and 73 police officers are reported to be among the missing. The first accounts have begun to emerge of what happened on board the hijacked aircraft, which crashed into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. Passengers made phone calls saying the planes were being hijacked by men armed with knives. Here, extra security measures are in place at public buildings and military installations. The Prime Minister is to meet defence and security chiefs in Downing Street this morning. Those are the latest headlines. Back to Jeremy and Sophie.
Maura, thanks very much. Well, yesterday's terrorist attack shocked Americans around the world. Riz Latif has been at the US Embassy in London, which has become a focus for Americans in Britain.
When the news broke, one of the first visitors to the American embassy was a man grateful for word that his brother was safe.
But thank goodness he's alive, so I bring flowers to the American people.
Others were still in shock.
It's just a tremendous sense of emptiness. Just hard to grasp.
I only pray for those that were harmed, and I pray the perpetrators will be found and punished.
As darkness fell, Americans began to gather outside the embassy for a candlelit vigil with each other for support.
I took a nap and woke up to a horror movie on television, and I don't know when I'm going back. All flights are canceled, so it's just up to, well, I guess the government when the flights can, I can't even talk.
Yeah.
I spoke to a family who have only just moved from New York to London. Have you managed to contact friends and family?
Only through the internet. I haven't been able to phone anybody yet because the phone lines have just been jammed up.
There's no getting through on the phone.
Yeah.
In the New York area, at least. I tried a few numbers. It's real tough.
Even their 9-year-old son was aware of the attacks.
They had like tape recordings of people in New York, you know, just like, you know, and the building's falling down and they're just like reporting it for you, and it was so sad.
The mood amongst Americans here in London is one of shock and disbelief as they try to come to terms with what's happened. The situation compounded by the fact that the true extent of the devastation is still continuing to unfold. Riz Latif, BBC News, at the American Embassy in London.
Well, our reporter Charles Rhodes is outside the US Embassy in central London at the moment. Charles, any movement there so far this morning?
Well, as you can see, Jeremy, behind me, it's very quiet. There have been one or two people around. I was speaking to someone when I was down a few hours ago in the middle of the night who just wandered here from his hotel because he was an American businessman working in London and just felt he needed to be close to America, and this is where he came, and I was was talking to him. He didn't want to appear on television, but he was saying that he works in the World Trade Center normally and was desperately trying to get hold of colleagues and find news about colleagues who work there. But because all the phone lines that we've been hearing through the morning have been down to America, he wasn't able to get through. And he just came here dazed and numbed, like many people, but obviously with a close interest in what's been happening in America. And there are others, as we saw in Mrs. Peace, who've gathered here. And some of them have talked about coming back later on today. We're expecting the ambassador in a little bit later on in the morning, so perhaps there'll be some more news then.
Charles, what advice is there for the large American expatriate community in this country? What should they do now if they can't get through to their people at home?
They're going to have to sit tight and wait is the advice that they're giving. I mean, we're expecting people to come up here to try and find ways of getting through to America when the phone lines ease, as systems are switched back on during the day. That might become easier. One person I spoke to managed to speak to his mother, so he managed to get some news, but wasn't able to speak to his wife and speak to his children and find news of them. They're not in New York, fortunately, or in any of the other areas affected by the outrages. But the advice from the embassy is just to sit tight and wait. The lines will open eventually.
OK, Charles Rhodes there at the US Embassy in Mayfair in central London. Thanks for joining us.
If you're just joining us this morning, some of the news coming in today is that there are believed to be still people alive under the rubble of the World Trade Center. Some people, we understand, have been pulled out alive already this morning. The attacks on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon have already had an impact on the global markets. The Nikkei index fell sharply on opening, dropping through the 10,000 barrier in Japan. And the value of the FTSE 100 index fell by over 5% yesterday. Well, Declan Curry joins us now from the London Stock Exchange. Declan.
Hello, Sophie. Good morning, everyone. The first reaction of the markets here in London wasn't about money. There are people who work here in the city and down the river at Canary Wharf who have friends and colleagues who work in New York, and a lot of phone calls were made to check if those folks were okay. They were also worried here in the city about the prospect of a similar attack. Many people left work in the city of London early yesterday. This particular building here at the London Stock Exchange itself was evacuated. But amid all that shock and all that panic, shares slumped in value, while the price of traditional safe haven investments such as bonds and gold soared. The price of oil rose on the commodity markets. The value of the dollar fell on the currency markets. Well, Jeremy Batstone is from NatWest Stockbrokers and he joins us here at the Stock Exchange this morning. Jeremy, first overwhelming reaction wasn't about stocks and shares, it was people checking that their friends in New York were okay.
Quite right, yes. The extent of the human tragedy has yet to be unfurled, of course, but it's quite clear that there has been complete carnage, and many people working in the city, as you rightly say, have friends and relatives who work in New York.
But the financial market does keep going, and shares fell in London yesterday, some worse than others.
That's right, yes. So we saw significant falls amongst the banks and particularly the insurance sector. Of course, the cost of to the insurance sector of all the damage that has been done is going to be absolutely enormous. Many American companies are going to have to pick up the bill. Many European companies have, of course, got significant exposure in the United States. So there's been a blanket fall.
There is talk about the impact that this might have on the global economy, whether this event is the harbinger of a global recession. Very early to say, I know, but what's the line?
Well, it is very difficult to talk about the implications of this. Nonetheless, we know that consumer confidence was the straw that was holding the US economy above water. And of course, it now appears if the US consumer is encouraged to save rather than spend, that the economy could very well have moved into negative territory in the third quarter. Also, of course, there's been significant disruption to corporate life in the United States, and that also will have a bearing on economic activity too.
Okay, Jeremy Batstone from NatWest Stockbrokers, thank you very much. Of course, the market's still focusing not on the financial cost of this atrocity, but on the real human cost of it. We'll update you from here as necessary on any developments during the course of the morning. Try and have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Have you been trying to get in touch with friends or relatives in the States? Let us know how they are. Let us know how you're feeling this morning. breakfasttv@bbc.co.uk. As ever, our email address to contact us here on the programme.
Well, let's get the latest weather right now, though, with Sarah Wimshurst.
Thanks, Sophie. Hello there. Well, there's a lot of dry but cloudy weather across the UK at the moment. Some cloud and rain, though, towards the northwest of Scotland. And we're expecting that.
We'll continue with our live BBC coverage of the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. In just a moment, we'll be simulcasting the BBC morning show for about the next 2 hours or so here on C-SPAN, and get back to it in just a moment. Also, we'll be taking your phone calls on Tuesday's attacks beginning at 6 a.m.